So it's my pleasure today to introduce to you Fred Halstead of the Socialist Workers' Party, who is their presidential campaign for the coming presidential election in 1968. Talking to Fred, I found a few things about his past, many of which identify here with our own community. Fred's very young, from my perspective. He's 40 years old, and is from Los Angeles originally, and did go to UCLA. So we welcome you back here to your alma mater, which I think has probably changed radically since you were here. And I think for the better, but that doesn't mean we haven't got a long way to go yet. Mr. Halstead is presently, or at least up to the last 2 years when he took off full-time for anti-war work, living in New York, associated with the garment workers as a cloth cutter and as organizer. He's written one book, Harlem Stairs. Steers?
Stirs.
How's it sound?
Stirs. S-T-I-R-S.
S-T-I-R-S.
Stirs.
What does that mean?
It means, something stirring up.
Oh,
Bubbling
Harlem
up.
Stirs. I see. Good. Concerned with the rent strikes in the ghetto back in the era of 1963 to 64. My own almost acquaintance began a couple of years ago. Mr. Halstead became full-time anti-war activist with the Fifth Avenue Parade Committee and then the National Mobilization Committee, and was fundamentally involved in the April 15th demonstration, the New York half, which many of us out here participated in, the San Francisco half, and then in the October 21st demonstration of just last month. It really is almost 4 years since I have attended a meeting in connection with the Socialist Worker Party, or the relatively related group, Young Socialist Alliance, and it really was in connection with almost the same stage of development. This was just before, or just at the beginning of, the presidential campaign of 1964, when our leader Lyndon Johnson was running for office against Barry Goldwater. I disagreed with many of the points of view set forth in that meeting one interval of presidential election ago, yet to my knowledge, the point of view presented was the only group on the left, that is, presenting a point of view against Johnson. Obviously, there are many persons on the right who were speaking against Johnson. So I think that today probably have a rare opportunity. Here's someone speaking from the point of view of the Socialist Workers' Party, who is himself running for the office of president in 1968, the comments he has to make about the whole electoral process in the United States. I say I got up and argued strongly 4 years ago that the difference between Johnson and Goldwater was a significant one, and we should all get strongly behind Johnson. I think that, and it's not the only mistake I made in my life, but it was probably, as far as politics goes and the welfare of our country, the greatest mistake. I don't feel that I was completely stupid. There were almost no points of view from the left that were arguing against Johnson, and I was relieved a year ago when Noam Chomsky confessed to me that he also voted for Johnson, and I find Noam about as intelligent on these matters as anyone. I'm very sorry, and I apologize to everyone, that I'm not going to be able to stay. And I hope that some other time I get to hear from some of you the various points that are going to be made today. I'm also an academic, although a lot of people in the surrounding community don't believe that anymore. But I hope there's someone here today of the kind who records the things I say. And I want to now tell him that at 12:30 I'm going to a departmental meeting, not off to an anti-war parade, which is usually the reverse way around. But I'm very sorry, there's an emergency meeting of our philosophy department, and I have to chair such meetings. So, without the word, really again a pleasure to introduce to you Fred Halstead.
Thank you. I haven't been at UCLA since I quit school 20 years ago. I used to say because it was interfering with my education. But actually I just ran out of money. And this building wasn't here. And a lot of other things weren't here at that time. I'd like to thank the Chair for Great Men Society for making this available, and the administration of the school for its attitude towards these things. It's an attitude which has distinctly improved over the last generation, or at least compared with 20 years ago. A lot of people in the anti-war movement, a lot of young radicals that are coming along now, sometimes say that this is a country which is on the verge of fascism, or is a most undemocratic situation, and it's going down the drain and so on. I'd like to take issue with that in a certain respect. My observations are that this country is freer now than it has been in over a generation. I remember when I was here 20 years ago, I tried to pass out a leaflet on campus. It wasn't even a socialist leaflet. It had something to do with veterans' rights. And that was not allowed. And as a matter of fact, when I stood down there by the bus stop, I don't know if you still have buses in this town, just off campus, and tried to pass it out, the police came by and chased me away. I had to make an American civil liberties case out of it just to win the right to stand on the public sidewalk and pass out a relatively innocuous leaflet. That was the attitude of the authorities and the administration, school and city-wise, to almost any kind of discussion at that time. Forums such as this were unheard of on this campus and on most of them in this country. Now I go from campus to campus, in addition to other places on the speaking tours, and I've yet to find a campus that doesn't have tables set up where literature of all varieties is being distributed by the students, including right-wing literature, Ayn Rand stuff, and so on, and left-wing literature, and Che Guevara, and socialist stuff, and communist stuff, and so on. And that, I submit, is a certain kind of progress, and bodes well for this generation, and for this country, and for the world. There are certain exceptions, of course. I recall about 3 weeks ago I went to the University of California at Berkeley to observe a picket line which the students there had mounted against the presence on campus recruiting of the CIA. And while I was there, a newsman recognized me from a previous news conference and came up to ask some questions and have an interview. And he put this little microphone from his tape recorder under my nose and asked me, didn't I think that this was an interference with the right of free speech of the CIA on behalf of these anti-war students. I told him no, I didn't think so, that I didn't see how free speech could be involved with an agency whose total public vocabulary consists of no comment. And then he asked me, well, what about the right of recruitment? I mean, they let everybody recruit here. Why not them? Isn't that interfering with a right, a democratic right? I said, well, if the chancellor had invited everybody, then there might be a point to that. But he hasn't invited, for example, the NLF of Vietnam or Che Guevara when he was alive. They just invite one side. So that democratic right is not involved either. And he said, and by this time a few students started to gather around and nod a little bit here and there. Then he said, well, after all, you're talking about communists that are overthrowing elected governments. I said, no, that's my objection to the CIA. They go around overthrowing elected governments, but never engaging in public debate about it. They do it all on the sly, conspiratorially, and they're coming around to recruit for these processes, which are not in the realm of the exchange of ideas, but rather in the realm of conspiratorial coup d'etats. This was not the style of Che Guevara, or even of the NLF. Che Guevara wrote down his ideas on social change and let them be read and discussed by the world. And one of the points that he made in his book on guerrilla warfare was that revolutionaries are not, it is not wise for them or justified for them to take up armed struggle against a regime until the constitutional processes had been exhausted, and if there were any chance to do it through those processes. Only when the democratic means were shut off was it justifiable or practical, because it has to be, in order to be practical, it has to be justified in the minds of the masses of the people in the country. Well, as I say, a lot of the students started nodding about this. And then a tall gentleman approached me. I was informed later that he was known among the students as Dean Fuzz on the Berkeley campus. And he told me that I would have to leave because my presence was inimical to the regulations of the campus. Apparently he recognized me as some kind of an anti-war agitator or something like that, and maybe he'd overheard a couple of things I'd told the newsman, and he was really frightened that these students were somehow going to get out of hand. I had absolutely nothing to do, of course, with agitating them. I was observing their picket line, and I joined it because I agreed with it. But Dean Fuzz took me by the arm and tried to escort me out, and I refused to go. He said, well, then he's going to call 8 policemen over to remove me. So I told him, listen, have a little respect for the presidential candidate. You wouldn't do that to Romney or McCarthy or any of those. He says, well, you got to have permission to be on campus. Let me see your identification. My identification. I gave him my driver's license, and he says, does this entitle you to be on campus? I said, it entitles me to drive an automobile in New York State. He wanted my identification. I don't need permission to be on campus, just like all these other people that aren't students. So he called the police, and I then entered the picket line and said in a loud voice to inform the students what had happened. And I was surrounded by them and a couple of newsmen, at which point the policemen began to see that it would be very poor press relations to press this further, and retreated, and I stayed there until I had to go to another speaking engagement. My point is that while the country is freer than it has been in some time, and in some respects probably freer than it's ever been, it is only so as long as we press our civil liberties and extend them and exercise them in spite of attempts to restrict them. And this is very important. After the October 21st demonstration in in Washington, D.C., the last, which marched on the Pentagon. You recall that President Johnson attacked the anti-war movement and said that he would remain in the fighting and until, quote, the aggressor learns that he cannot take over another country's land by force and violence, end quote. Obviously, an objective observer, not knowing the rest of the facts and just hearing Johnson's statements on this matter, would have to assume that the big bad Vietnamese have an army in Texas. The reverse, of course, is true. And all their arguments tend to be that absurd these days. So absurd that every serious intellectual in the country has been forced to disassociate himself from them. And there are serious splits and differences within the ruling circles themselves. Vice President Humphrey got a little closer to the truth when he said that there's a vital interest of the United States in Vietnam. Peace and stability in Asia, he said. Well, just what is this vital interest of which they speak for the United States in Vietnam? What is it about that country or that situation that is essential to the life processes of the United States? So essential that it requires that our young men be sent to die 10,000 miles away in a war which most of them don't understand and which a very large part of them are absolutely opposed to. What is it so vital? It all depends, of course, on what you consider vital in this country. If you think that the most vital things are to preserve the lives of our young men, or to rebuild our cities and replace the slums with low-rent housing, or to eliminate the inflation that is caused by the war and so on, then obviously the war is as mad as can be. But if you think that the thing without which this country cannot operate is the right of big business to invest its surplus capital profitably overseas, then you come out with an entirely different answer. Because there is method in Johnson's madness from that point of view. What happened in Vietnam, you see, was a revolution which is going on, which threatens to take that part of the world outside the sphere of capitalist investment. And that occurs at a time when a good part of the world is already outside that sphere, and when an even larger part is on the verge, and historically speaking, on the verge of similar revolutionary developments. And also at a time when there is a tremendous surplus of investment capital in this country seeking profitable investment. Now, that's the reason for the war in Vietnam, the fundamental reason. And that's what Johnson and Humphrey and the others mean when they talk about support our boys in Vietnam. They mean send our GIs over there to fight and die to defend somebody else's right to invest profitably. And that's what they mean when they talk about fighting for freedom. They mean the freedom of U.S. big business to invest profitably in these areas. And that's what they mean when they talk about the free world. That's why, for example, such peculiar spots as South Africa are considered by them to be part of the free world when everybody knows they're as free as a concentration camp. They have only one freedom, and that has nothing to do with individual human freedom or intellectual freedom or those things which we should cherish and fight for. It has simply to do with one freedom, and that is the freedom of U.S. big business to invest profitably. That's the only freedom they've got in South Africa, for example. And that's what they're talking about. Now, that's the cause of and the continuing reason for the war in Vietnam, in spite of the differences within the ruling class over the strategy of the matter. Now, this doesn't mean, I don't mean to imply by this that it's going to take necessarily that we wait until we have a socialist revolution in this country before we can end the war in Vietnam. It will be possible, I think, and it is possible, theoretically. It has happened in other places with other capitalist countries and other times. To force this government, even under its present essentially structure, to remove itself from this adventure. But it does mean that in order to force them to do that, they must be faced with an independent force which they cannot control and which they must reckon with as they reckon with military defeats or with the weather. In that respect, I think it would be a prime tragedy if this anti-war movement, which has burgeoned and developed in this country in the last 2 years, were to be channeled back into, for example, the Democratic Party, or were to become a doorbell-pushing operation for a Eugene McCarthy or a Bobby Kennedy. Not that I don't think that the divisions on this question are important, or not that I'm not glad to see Eugene McCarthy come out critical of Johnson's policy. I think that's very useful and very important because it extends the discussion to broader numbers of American people, and it is very useful for the anti-war movement. The more division there is on this question within the ruling circles, the more opportunity and elbow room there is for building an independent force and for against the war. It's positive in that sense, but it would be very negative if that independent force were to lose its independence. Now, it's relatively simple to maintain the independence of a big movement when its activities are confined to the streets and around a single issue. It's much trickier when you get into electoral politics and multi-issue questions. Then you have to take responsibility for a full program and for a stand on the nature of the system which leads to the war. For this movement, this anti-war movement, to become trapped in the parties which are controlled by those in whose vital interest the war is being fought, will end it up the same place it ended up after millions of people voted for Johnson as a peace candidate in 1964. It's not that I don't think that Senator McCarthy is necessarily personally less trustworthy than Johnson. I just don't know about that. But I know that he is pledged to the maintenance of the capitalist system, and that he shares the view of Johnson and Humphrey that a vital interest is the right of big business to invest profitably overseas, and that indeed that vital interest is involved in Vietnam. I heard him speak 2 weeks ago at a conference in Chicago, and he said there that he had no disagreement with the stated purposes of the administration in Vietnam, nor was he able, he said, to make a moral judgment on the methods being used in the war. While he said there was some question raised by the difference in technological level of the two sides. We have an air force and napalm and all that kind of stuff, and they don't. Still, people get killed in all wars, flesh is torn by bullets, and you can't make a moral judgment, he said, on that. You could make a moral judgment on one grounds, he said. Is the cost of the war worth it? And he said it's not. The wrong war at the wrong time, therefore it's an immoral war. According to that kind of morality, if the war were cheap enough, any crime that's cheap enough would be okay. As, for example, was the crime of the invasion of the Dominican Republic. They got away with it fast, so that's okay. Well, I have a different morality than that. I don't think that the United States has any right to impose governments of any kind on other peoples in other parts of the world. And I believe that peoples in other parts of the world, if they want to be communists or socialists or anything else, have a right to be that, and have a right to decide that question after their own fashion. We are told, well, they're using revolution, guerrilla warfare, terrorism, civil war, so on. We've used all those methods in this country to decide our governments. Revolution, civil war between parts of the country, civil war between classes, guerrilla warfare, remember Kansas, terrorism, huge areas of the country. Elections, both honest and occasionally crooked. It should be the other way around, both crooked and occasionally honest. But it wouldn't have helped matters in this country to have had a foreign power send 500,000 troops in here or more to shoot up the place and try to impose some norm on us. We had to settle that our way. And if that's our right, it's other people's right as well. I'm only supposed to speak for about a half an hour, and we now have a half an hour left. So shall we open it up for questions at this point? Maybe we've said enough to provoke the questions now. I'd like to just say one more thing in order to provoke questions in a somewhat different line in addition, and that is a second plank in the Socialist Workers' Party platform in this campaign is to support the concept of black control of the black communities. We are for the black power movement. We believe that one of the reasons that there is exhibited such an obvious lack of appreciation for law and order in some of these communities is because it's not their law and their order. We think that they should should be allowed to control their communities, to draw the police from them, to control the police, to be armed in their own self-defense, as all Americans have the right to be, and most white people are already, to obtain low-interest loans, to be able to take over the stores in their community, established cooperatives, and so on. That's another plank in our platform which some people might want to question. Okay. Are there any questions?
How about explaining the difference between socialism and communism?
He says, explain the difference between socialism and communism. Well, as Marx used the terms as referring to political parties, they were interchangeable. The difference between socialism and communism in an economic sense is a level of a stage in development. What it has come to mean in this country is communism is kind of an epithet which you associate with the Soviet Union or maybe China, and you pin on somebody, and then they're written out of the human race. For that reason, when people ask me if I'm a communist, I like to answer yes, and then let them stumble and then sometimes they'll ask me, you mean you're a member of the Communist Party? And I say, oh no, they voted for Johnson in 1964. I wouldn't do that. I have certain disagreements with the Communist Party and certain agreements. And I think that's the way everybody ought to approach that question, and we ought to get rid of this anti-communist hysteria which is screwing this country up. Very badly. Just because a communist is against cancer doesn't mean you have to be for it. Now, my differences with say the regime in the Soviet Union, or my criticisms of it would be one thing, that it's not democratic enough. But I think that it will move towards more democracy under its own auspices. Not the regime, but the people, as the technology of the country develops, and it'll move the faster, the less interference it gets from the United States, and the less hostility, the less bases we build around these countries, and the less blockades we put around them, and so on. What happened to the Soviet Union reminds me of an old Russian proverb or story my grandfather used to tell me about the way the capitalists slander the revolution because of some of the difficulties that occurred afterwards, which were due to capitalist interference and distortions. The story goes that a young girl married outside of her religion in a Russian community, and this was very much frowned upon. They sat Shiva for her, that is, made like she was dead. She showed up a year later pregnant, and to see her parents because she missed them, and the father kicked her in the stomach and said, "Nothing good can come of any such marriage, get out of here." And then when the child was born deformed, he said, "See, I told you so, nothing good can come of any such marriage." Well, that's what the capitalist world did with the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution. They kicked it in the stomach and did everything they could to deform it, and they succeeded. And then they said, "See, socialism will never work, but it's working just the same, and we will see it overcome its deformities as well." Now you had a question.
Well, I was wondering if you talked about Peace and Freedom Party.
Yeah, the question is, what about the Peace and Freedom Party, which is making an attempt to get on the ballot in California? The laws about getting on the ballot in California are very restrictive and undemocratic, and personally, I hope you make it. I'd be glad to help you if there was any help that would help, just on a civil liberties basis. As far as the difference between the Peace and Freedom Party and the Socialist Workers' Party, well, I don't know what the program of the Peace and Freedom Party is. If it had an anti-capitalist program, I'd like to discuss joining forces. But I discussed that with leaders of the Peace and Freedom Party in San Francisco, and they tell me they do not want to adopt such a program. That they want to have a kind of a single issue or a double issue, peace and civil rights, and not take a position on the basic fundamental change in our society. Well, in my opinion, that's pursuing a will-o'-the-wisp, and it's more important in electoral politics, in multi-issue politics, to build solidly a cadre of people who are dedicated to fundamental social change. Now, it remains to be seen, in other words, what the Peace and Freedom Party develops into. And depending upon what it develops into, we would discuss supporting it or not. For example, if it became a party which simply ran a peace candidate of the character, say, of Dr. Spock or something like that, we wouldn't support it. Because Dr. Spock, while I know him personally and I worked with him in the anti-war movement, and he's a very fine fellow and useful to the anti-war movement and a decent guy. And he is a conservative in his attitude toward the society as a whole, and he's sincere in that. I don't think he'd vote for me and for president, and I wouldn't vote for him because we have a fundamental disagreement. Although we can walk together on a picket line or a demonstration against the war in Vietnam. That's on a single issue. The difference between him and me is that I want a revolution, a fundamental social change, and I want to build a political movement which teaches its people that, and which it develops that kind of a basis. And if you don't start doing that, then you never get that, you see. Does that answer the question? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
A moment ago you said that your second class is Black Power. How far do you think that the Black Power movement has come in the United States? How far have they come towards their goal, what they do now to reach their goal?
Well, it obviously hasn't come too far, because the black people don't have very much power in this country. They showed a little potentiality, a little heat lightning, in these uprisings which occurred. Showed another little potentiality in these elections which have occurred in Gary and Cleveland, where Negro candidates were elected mayor. Both of those things have their drawbacks, in my opinion, and are not really a black power, because the first one wasn't organized, and it will take political organization in the broad sense, not simply electoral, but political in the broad sense, community organization for all kinds of things, including even self-defense, in order to channel those revolutionary energies into a constructive and a direction which can make permanent gains for the black people, and which can develop a base of power for them, which they can use to gain allies out of the rest of the population. In my opinion, what's wrong with these elections in Cleveland and Gary was that the Negro candidates are tied to the Democratic Party machine. They are tied to the machine which is controlled by those who own the slums. And therefore, if they try to carry out some promises to build low-rent public housing and so on in those slums, they are not going to be able to get away with it unless they break with the Democratic Party. In my opinion, it would have been better for them to have run as independents and built a machine which was independent of the Democratic machine, and whether they won the election or not, they would have some black power. As it is now, they've built some power for somebody else. And but that, I expect, is a lesson which will be learned in the process. But I'm not saying here that I oppose these uprisings. I think that they were good things for this country. And I'm not one who goes out and make wild statements about urban guerrilla warfare or busting windows with no particular direction. I just say that, and I would much prefer to see, as I say, a political organization which actually channeled those energies into a more powerful and constructive direction. However, the fact that those things broke out revealed to the whole world what the situation was in some of these communities, which nobody believed or was willing to listen to before. I suspect there are people in this room who don't know, for example, that the Pacific Electric Railway was removed when they put in the Harbor Freeway. Maybe you've never even heard of it, I don't know. But when I was a kid, in this respect, the country is worse off than it was 20 years ago. When I was a kid, you could live in Watts and get to a job in Beverly Hills or in Hollywood or at the Cedars Lebanon Hospital, if you were a nurse's aide or a maid or something like that, which a lot of people there are, in 20 minutes for 35 cents, or maybe 35 minutes out to Hollywood or 40 minutes to Beverly Hills. Because they had a rapid transit Pacific Electric Railway that went all the way from the harbor through Watts and through downtown LA and out to Hollywood and so on. They tore it down, put up the Harbor Freeway, and these people that don't have cars can't get to work. It takes them 3 hours to get to work. And that's one of the reasons for the high unemployment rate in Watts, and one of the reasons for the attacks on the transportation system they've got in Watts, which is virtually useless. And if it hadn't been for that uprising, nobody ever would have paid any attention at all to their problems. Now, at least, somebody's trying to make an effort to bring in some buses and so on and so forth. There's a kind of grudging respect on the part of a lot of the white population towards people who fight rather than people who just sit and take it, and so on. Okay.
What do you feel is a good solution to the Vietnam problem?
I mean this quite realistically. I think the only solution to it, and unless this solution is taken sooner or later, it will simply fester and continue and grow worse, is for the withdrawal of U.S. forces from there, and as quickly as they can be, as transportation can be arranged for it. This raises a lot less problems than any other solution does, and it's the only honorable and principled solution, in my opinion. It's the only honorable and principled solution because any other solution interferes with the right of self-determination of the Vietnamese people. The United States has no right to negotiate anything about Vietnam in Vietnam. Just imagine what would happen if somebody raised a slogan that some other country be allowed to negotiate something that goes on inside the United States. Tell them you were nuts, throw them out, or even the Soviet Union, you know. The whole world would agree it's ridiculous. That's the Soviet Union's business to determine their internal affairs. Well, it's also the Vietnamese business. So I don't go for the negotiations position, although I understand that once you announce you're going to withdraw, then you might sit down around a table and make agreements that people aren't going to get shot as they're leaving, and that you're going to move through a certain area in order to get the trucks out, and so on and so forth. Those kind of negotiations, of course, are perfectly in order. As are arrangements about protecting people's lives who think that they might be killed because they've sided with the Americans or something like that. Well, you can put them on the ships with the American troops and bring them back here. I'd have no objection. If some racists in this country, however, who are supporting the war, might have an objection to letting those people into this country. That's their problem, not mine. Australia is a great, big, empty country crying for immigration. I could immigrate to Australia, a white communist, wouldn't bat an eye about it. You got a skilled trade? Yes. Your skin is white? Yes. Okay, come on over. But a Vietnamese physician, priest, anti-communist would not be allowed to do so because of the color of his skin. And we've got Australian troops over there fighting for the freedom of the Vietnamese. Come off it. Come off it. Nonsense. Nonsense. The old white man's burden. Racist arrogance. And we with white skins, happen to be a minority in this world, and things like this war are not making it any safer for us. Yeah.
So what line would your party organize revolution in America if you had the opportunity?
Would my party
What lines would you fuel revolution here?
Well, we run in elections. We organize mass demonstrations. We help workers win strikes and things like that. All those things are part of a revolutionary process. When a majority of the people in this country want a fundamental social change, we'll make it. If they don't recognize the election, then we'll cease to recognize them. And we'll nationalize the major industries in the country, not small business, but the major corporations, and have them operated instead of by a board of directors appointed by the major stockholders, which are a very small number of people, a board of directors elected by the public and the people in the industry. And we'll plan the economy by a planning board selected by a Congress of these representatives from the various industries, from consumer groups, from intellectual circles, colleges, and so on. We advocate an industrial democracy, in other words. You see, you've already got socialism or socialization within these big monopoly corporations. It's not a question, of some General Motors parts supplier trading with another wing of General Motors and so on and so forth. It's all planned within those big monopolies. But it's all done as a dictatorship, and it's not done in the public interest. It's done in the interest of the people who happen to control it, who are a very small minority. We would simply democratize that by the devices that I've explained. Go ahead.
When you'll be campaigning, what will you have to offer to the people in order to interest them in your party?
Well, that's what I've been trying to talk about.
What I mean is, like...
if nothing interests you, tell me what you're interested in.
Well, like, for example, what is it? Social...
Yes, we're for socialized medicine. We're for Medi-Cal on a very extended basis. As a matter of fact, it's kind of a scandal in the world that the United States doesn't have such a program, yet even a number of other capitalist countries do, and wouldn't do without it. And even the most conservative and right-wing people in those countries wouldn't propose that it be done away with. And still here we are in this great, big, fat, rich country in which there aren't enough doctors, and all kinds of artificial restrictions are made on that, and in which medicine is still something where the dollar is more important than fighting disease. It's ridiculous, and I trust that issue will become a strong one in this campaign.
What do you think, sir, the lack of power of the socialists here in this country? Is it the framework of the political structure, or is it due to lack of interest or disagreement with the principles?
The question was, what do I think the lack of strength or power of the socialists in this country is due to? Well, it's due to a number of factors. There's been a very lean 20 years or so for the American left. Very conservative period in our country's history. But it's passing now, and there is greater interest now. And it's due in part to McCarthyism, to this anti-communist hysteria, which included against the whole left. It's due to the fact that this hysteria entered the labor movement, which was built by socialists and communists and other radicals, and which cannot operate as an honest movement without them. And they were driven out of it to a large degree as a result of this hysteria, and their place was taken by gangsters of one kind or another, which is the inevitable process when you remove the soul, so to speak, from a social protest movement. But I see that process also tending to reverse. Little by little, there are cracks and fissures in the labor movement. I attended, as I say, a conference 2 weeks ago. That was a conference of labor leaders, of paid officials of unions in this country. 520 of them who are about to make a break with the AFL-CIO George Meany's policy in support of the war. It included a number of top officials of big unions, as well as a large number of secondary officials. And one of the points of discussion there was precisely this, not the strength of socialists. They're not that poor. They just as soon not see the socialists grow strong, because they know that's going to give them trouble in their own rank and file. But this anti-communist hysteria, they began to discuss the necessity to challenge the whole of the United States foreign policy over the last 20 years, and the whole question of the Cold War, which has led to to such things as Vietnam. And they resolved to begin this discussion within the ranks and the officialdom of the American labor movement, and that will now ensue. And I trust that the student-based anti-war movement will take advantage of that and try to send speakers and so on to unions if possible, and even pass out leaflets there, and try to look out towards the other sections of the population who are questioning the war and becoming interested in it, but who yet do not have all the facts that the students have got or all the militancy about it that they've got. In general, I would say that this country is now in a different mood entirely than it used to be. We socialists have a big job to take advantage of this from our point of view, and speak out and try to convince as many people as we can. But it's a mood of protest, of social protest, which goes far beyond the Vietnam War and which goes far beyond the campuses. It goes into the labor movement, just beginning. Goes into the Catholic Church, for example. You not only have large sections of the Catholic Church opposing the war, but within the Catholic Church all kinds of strange and heretofore unknown phenomena, such as organizations of priests opposing celibacy, organizations of nuns not quite opposing celibacy, but advocating other changes, and who knows what might come in the future. I cite that only to show that protest is not an unpopular thing in this country anymore. And when people tell you that the public will be angry with you because some protests are going on, you must remember that the public is made up of people, the majority of whom are now tending to be engaged in some kind of protest, even such people as those deeply involved in the Catholic Church, for example, a hitherto rather conservative force in our society, and so on. Any more questions here? question is, do I think the United States has an obligation of Vietnam to correct a lot of the damage that's been done to the country? Well, if there were, in an abstract sense, if there were any justice, absolutely. We'd have to send them a number of billions of dollars and plant an awful lot of trees over there to make up just for the damage that we've done to their countryside. But the main thing is to get off their backs, and then they'll take care of themselves. That's the main obligation we've got, to get off their backs and leave them alone. And then maybe we should send some of our students over there to learn something from them and come back and teach us a few things. I think that would probably be better than trying to send our people over there even to teach technology. I don't think that they trust us to teach them anything yet, and it'll take a little while before that wears off.
Where do you stand on those charges that are often made that black power and the new left is driving the country toward a great backlash, rightist conservative backlash? The black power, for example, might the charges might cause more difficulty than otherwise.
Well, I think the facts show the opposite. The white backlash, so-called, is not nearly as strong as people expected it to be after these revolts. As a matter of fact, as I say, there's a certain grudging respect among even racist whites for people who stand up and fight for what they want. In general, this kind of a question is the same thing that is always said to people trying to make change and engage in protest or activity to do it, that, my goodness, you're going to make people mad at you. But the facts are, you don't have to be wild or nutty or do something that is not to the point. Those kind of things do make people mad at you, and count against you. And I can describe something later about that. But the overall picture is that precisely the opposite is the case. Look at this country right now. As I said, people are worried that they're going to take our civil liberties away from us. But as I say, we didn't have anywhere near as many civil liberties as we've got today 5 years ago. What has given us these kinds of civil liberties, and they are very important, has been the protests, the free speech movement, and then the student-based anti-war movement, which for the first time cracked through this whole anti-communist hysteria, the first time in our generation, established the principle that people can work together with communists or anybody else as long as they agree on a certain point and then disagree on other points when they disagree. Established that whole principle in the SDS did it in their first March on Washington, which established this new anti-war movement. It did it against the advice and against the orders of conservative members of the peace movement, such as Norman Thomas, Bayard Rustin, and so on, who said just exactly this. You take the Vietnam War issue directly, you'll make too many people mad at you. Hit it at an angle. You let the communists in, you'll alienate all kinds of people. Don't do that. Let them in, but not publicly. Lie about it a little bit, like we've been doing all these years, and like the Democratic Party does, and like the labor movement does, because none of those things operate without radicals. The truth is that the life process of this society doesn't move without people like me. Not as far as social protest movements and labor unions and so on are concerned. That's where the trade is learned in the radical movement. Now let's be honest about that, you see. Let's be honest about that. SDS said, yeah, let's be honest about that. Everybody comes in. They just organized the biggest demonstration that anybody had ever organized before, in spite of these birds, you see. And because it was a demonstration which was to the point and so on and so forth. Now, on another level, of course, I remember I had to argue with a kid in New York after this recent demonstration who somebody alleged that he broke a window in a store. during the demonstration with a brick. I told him, well, you know, I don't really see the connection between that store window and the war in Vietnam, and I'm afraid that most of the American public will not see it either, especially since it was 7 blocks away from where the demonstration was. And, you know, what's the point? But it's quite a different thing, you see, to mass your 10,000 people in front of that hotel where Secretary Rusk was and let the world know that he can't even come into town without thousands of Americans protesting the war. That's to the point, and that improves your situation and extends your liberties and continues the momentum of your movement. And that's what's happening also with the Black Power movement. As the blacks develop their own power and raise a little hell in a judicious way, they will get support, which people wouldn't have expected to come. If the blacks organize themselves politically in their communities, right now, if they had an independent black political party, for example, which got the vote out, they could double the number of congressmen they've got in the next election, just like that. Get out of the Democratic Party and start doing that. They've actually got the physical power, that many people in that many central cities, to do that just right off the bat. And they become a force to reckon with. If, for example, black people in a community or see a building project to come in, which didn't have any, and in that town they don't have any, say, plumbers, Negro plumbers in the union, and they could surround that building project because it's in their community and we got that many people, or that many guns for that matter. See, when it's to the point, people justify it. To shut that thing down until they took in some black apprentices in the plumbers union, why, they'd get some respect. And you can say, well, that's going to make the plumbers union awful mad. Maybe some, but I'll tell you, there'll be an awful lot of plumbers that'll have respect for them. And say, well, gee, yeah, that's right, you got a right to have some apprentices here, and so on. They need some power. And that's what we're talking about by black power. We don't mean, it's not a racist concept. It's a question of using your force to your own benefit, and using it to your own benefit, even if it appears that that it's not to the benefit of some whites. I think it is to the benefits even of the whites, but the whites don't think so. So why should the blacks wait? They get what they can by their own forces, and when they begin that process, then they will get allies, and they will be able to deal with those allies as equals. There is no equality without standing on your own feet and having some power behind your own words. Is there anybody else who hasn't asked a question yet? Oh, this fellow, yeah. What? Why doesn't Ho Chi Minh want to negotiate? Well, he doesn't want to negotiate away a piece of his country. Doesn't think he has to negotiate the presence of foreign troops on his soil any more than, and if I were president, I would think that it would be necessary to negotiate with an invader to get out of my country, or Johnson for that matter. That's not something one negotiates. Once you start negotiating that, you've given up some of your sovereignty. You see, I think that's just a plain principled question. He negotiated that question once before and got royally, what's a less juicy term? You remember that? No, just let me describe that very briefly. Ho Chi Minh was the president of all Vietnam in 1946. 3 years before there was such a thing as Red China. Before Mao was in power in Red China. Before there was Red Chinese government in Peking. Because he had led the resistance against the Japanese and the Vichy French colonials, the regime which occupied the country during the Second World War. And he had taken the surrender of the Japanese and controlled the country physically, and had to be recognized for the moment, because France, was still just coming out of the war and so on. As soon as France brought herself together and established her capitalist government, unfortunately with members of the Communist Party within it, getting lost, you see, instead of being independent, they decided to go back and take Indochina, of which Vietnam was a part, back for French colonialism, and send an invading army over there. People talk about the big international communist plot involved. Most people don't remember that the Communist Party in France voted for this French invasion of Ho Chi Minh's country. You see? Try that on Ronald Reagan and stuff like that. It was a race question. That's the simple truth. As far as the French were concerned, that was you might even say, from my point of view, a betrayal of the revolution on the part of the French communists. But that's just a simple fact. And the Ho Chi Minh resisted and finally defeated the French in 1954. The United States, instead of siding with their old ally Ho Chi Minh, whom they had armed when he was fighting the Japanese, sided in this case with France and armed France and helped them fight Ho Chi Minh. But even that didn't save them, and they lost. The Viet Minh, as the Viet Cong were then called, controlled all of North Vietnam by the time that the war was over, with the exception of the city, and most of South Vietnam. And they negotiated the withdrawal of the French troops. And the negotiation agreement was the Geneva Agreement, and it called for the French to evacuate the northern half of the country, and for the Viet Minh to evacuate the southern half, well, most of which they controlled anyway. In return for which, the French were to remove themselves within 2 years in this process, and allow an election to take place in 1956, and the winner of that election would be the president of the entire country. So they negotiated away a piece of their territory there to leave the French on for a while. Now the French did get out. The trouble is the Americans moved in their place and established a dictatorial regime under Ngo Dinh Diem, whom they picked out of a western country and set down there, and wouldn't allow the elections in 1956 because, as President Eisenhower, who was president at the time, said, if we had, Ho Chi Minh would have won in the entire country. He is, after all, the father of his country, even though he's a communist. I often like to show friends of mine a picture I have of George Washington, and I say, look, the Ho Chi Minh of his country. That's not an exaggeration in the minds of the Vietnamese. And I have criticisms of Ho Chi Minh, rather serious ones, but, credit where credit is due. So I don't see why he should negotiate anything with the United States, except the route by which they will get out of his country as fast as they can go. And I'm sure that the NLF will agree not to shoot the American soldiers in the back as they leave, or not to insist that they run instead of walking carefully, or anything like that. I'm also utterly convinced that they will agree quite readily not to shoot South Vietnamese who have sided with the Americans, because they have nothing to gain from so doing. Those people are a tiny minority of the country, and can simply be allowed to live lives as individuals. But if they feel that they are in danger, I say yes. Let them get on the ships with the American soldiers and come home. I won't mind living next door to one. I wonder what those pro-warriors will say about that.
Yes?
Mr. Halstead, why do you think socialism is more beneficial to America considering how well capitalism is done?
Yeah. Well, capitalism has done well in some respects and not so well in other respects. We keep getting involved in these wars, you see, getting our young men killed, which I think is a result of the capitalist system here. We have our race problem, which I think is also a result of it. We have things like, you don't see it so much here in Los Angeles, like the literal choking of our central cities by a lack of planning, but by the fact that there is no planned economy in this country, and by the fact that under the capitalist system there tends to be an obsession with artificial individualism, which really submerges real individual humanity. There seems to be an insistence that everybody's got to get to work in his central city in his own private $3,000 box over some big superhighway that flattens all kinds of living space and park space and so on and so forth wherever it goes, and costs much more, all of this put together, 10 times as much as the most efficient rapid transit system would cost. But of course, if we put in those kind of rapid transit systems, it would have to be done publicly by the government, as the highways are. And it would change the automobile orientation of the society and so on and so forth, and interfere with General Motors' particular profit structure, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are why and a lot of others are why I think that socialism would be better for the country. But I do not denigrate the good things that we have, such as they are, like our civil liberties, which we were not given by the capitalists, but which we win for ourselves, and like our standard of living, which wouldn't be any lower under socialism, and so on and so forth. That's my opinion. I realize that Mr. Ram would probably tend to have a somewhat different opinion, and I respect it, because he is a capitalist of sorts. It's not something to be ashamed of as an individual human being, in India, that is. I'm talking about a system here, not about, and when I say bad, angry things about the capitalist system, I mean the system, not the individual human beings involved.
Well, where do you stand on the, what we should do with the selective services? Effectively.
I think we should just abolish the draft. And concretely, I think we should resist it in whatever way is effective. And we probably have differences of opinion about that. I don't personally advocate or encourage individual people to face 5 years in jail, although I support them if they do, and admire their courage and think that's an important part of the general anti-war movement. If someone were to ask me, however, personally what I think a person should do, I'd say, stay out any way you can without going to jail. And if you just absolutely can't do anything else, then go in and maintain your rights as an individual human being, which you do have legally, and which the American Civil Liberties Union will support, and give leaflets to your buddies and do all those things short of violating regulations, which you have a right to do. I had a clipping on me, but unfortunately I seem to have lost it, which came from a GI. A story about this GI, who was falsely reported dead, and his parents were shipped back the wrong body, who happened to have a similar name, and had a funeral for the poor guy and all that. And then it was reported that this was the wrong person, and their son was alive, so they brought him back from Vietnam, the live one. And when he got off the plane, they had his parents there, and the TV and so on, to watch this dramatic reunion. And when they asked him what he felt, the first thing he said was that we ought to get out of Vietnam, and we shouldn't be there. It's a terrible tragedy. It's not our war. And the most significant thing he said was that that's what my buddies told me to say. So that I don't think. Well, I think the selective service is something that should be fought against. It is also at the same time an Achilles heel of the capitalist war machine. They are drafting a lot of people who are against the war, and that ought to give them as much trouble as possible. You get my point? That is not to say anything against demonstrations, against the draft, resistance to the draft. I'm involved right now in organizing such a massive demonstration outside the Whitehall Induction Center in New York City, where young men will burn their draft cards and where masses of people will go to talk to the draftees and encourage them to take whatever method of resistance that they personally feel is appropriate for them. Yeah.
Domestic social program. Could you be a little bit more explicit on exactly what you think, what your program is in social, in terms of nationalization of industry?
Yes, we would, as I say, we would nationalize the major industries. We would establish a socialized medicine system. We would I don't have my program here, my platform here, but we would lower the voting age to 18. We would pay students who need to be paid in order to go to school. And we would offer preferential treatment in that respect to the black people. We would have black control of the schools in those communities, and we would educate people in Afro-American history honestly, rather than in a distorted way as it is presently taught, not so much in the universities, but in the high schools and so on. And the whole traditional list of socialist measures, which are not particularly unique to us, and which are sometimes adopted, in small part, even in some capitalist countries. But what we advocate is a fundamental social change to eliminate the exploitation of man by man and establish a society in which people don't spend all their time, or very much of their time at all, just trying to stay alive or run after the buck, but in which they are assured a decent living with a relatively few hours' work and plenty of time and plenty of facilities to develop their individuality after that, after their own individual fashion. I might say also, crowd's getting kind of small, that we would remove from the books laws that have to do with crimes without victims, such as the Narcotics Act, which has created more addicts in this country than probably any other single thing, and which has created a racket. We would make that stuff available by doctor's prescription and eliminate, therefore, the racket. And similar measures. I don't advocate the use of such things, but I don't think people ought to be put in jail for them. I don't advocate overeating either, but I don't think people ought to be put in jail for it.
Mr. Halstead, the program you suggest as regards narcotics was followed by Britain till recently, and they changed it the same system that you now have in America. Do you not think they were right in doing that?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think they changed it to the same system. Our system is pretty bad, and has been. You know, we didn't have this kind of a narcotics problem until we got the Narcotics Act. We used to have addicts in this country, but we just didn't put them in jail. Now, 3/4 of our prison population is connected with that, with addiction or the racket connected there too. It's a tremendous social waste, which can be handled as a medical problem, and which is a serious medical problem. And in some cases isn't even a medical problem, as with certain drugs, not any more than liquor is. But which is a hysteria in this country. That's the simple truth. It's a hysteria, which didn't exist. You know, we didn't have a Narcotics Act until about 1914. Before that, you could buy it in a dime store. The country didn't crash to the ground in a fume of opium smoke. I don't advocate buying it at a dime store, but I don't advocate filling up prisons with and manufacturing a racket artificially. Okay.
You were right in theory that it was a consistent negotiator, but I think if you were practical, you would agree to a negotiated settlement and have the American troops withdraw, and you would have the whole country to itself.
Yes, I say if he wants to make that kind of arrangement, that's okay for him to make. And probably that's the way things will end up. But it has to be on the understanding that the American troops are going to leave there. That has to be understood first. Then they can sit down and decide, what road they're going to take, so on. I don't think that's the understanding so far. Not seriously. They're building permanent bases. The United States is building permanent bases over there, and so on. Listen, I think that we really have to break this off. Okay? I'm sorry. We lose a lot of the audience.
I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I'm sure if any of you have any more individual questions to ask of Fred, you can talk to him now. There's a literature table in the back that has some literature on the black struggle and on the Vietnam struggle. Also, if anyone is interested in supporting Fred and Halstead and Boutel in the coming election, we have literature back there and sign-up sheet for people who are interested in that. Thank you.